the guy that wrote the story of the Scopes trial that Scopes was going to be tried for teaching evolution. This got in the national news in early '95 was a guy named John Mutu, who worked for the Knoxville News. He was the first to write about this. And he actually befriended John Scopes and lived in an apartment in Fort Sanders, and Scopes came and visited him a few times during that strange summer here in Knoxville. Another connection is Paul Y. Anderson. There are about half a dozen journalists at least from Knoxville who were at the trial reporting for the national media in those days. One was Paul Y. Anderson from South Knoxville, was from the Island Home area. He was reporting for the St. Louis Post-Gazette. He later won the Pulitzer Prize for reporting on the Teapot Dome scandal. Another guy was Ben Winnick, who was the son of a rabbi here. He had been a law student of John R. Neal's here at UT, and he was reporting on the trial in Dayton in 1925 for the Journal, the Knoxville Journal, and also for a national Yiddish language newspaper in New York. He was the guy reporting to them and for their use in their paper. But after H.L. Mencken, of course, who's writing for the Baltimore Sun, who is kind of notorious for his insults in Tennessee, I think the most scathing and quotable accounts of the trial were those of a correspondent for The Nation magazine, who grew up about 3 blocks from where we are right now. His name was Joseph Wood Crouch, and he's one of many people who used to be well remembered, but is no longer that often mentioned at his alma mater. He was a UT graduate as well. UT graduate who graduated from UT in 1915, later got his PhD at Columbia University, which is in the news a lot lately and turns up in this story quite a lot as well. He was there at Columbia about 17 years after John R. Neal himself was a student at Columbia. John R. Neal is a very big subject, and and maybe because of that, I've never written much about it before. I just have to give a disclaimer right away. I've known about him my whole life. I think as a kid, I knew who John R. Neal was. People talked about him. But when I began writing about Knoxville, so many people had known him personally in the 90s and had John R. Neal stories that I wasn't sure what I could add to that. But now it's not the case anymore. I think there are very few people alive today, even though I knew people personally in the 1990s who had interviewed him several times, who had known him, who had worked with him. Now I don't know of anyone like that. And I know a few people who knew him when he was an old man and they were small children, and they were scared of him because he was a bizarre character in the streets of downtown Knoxville that only his friends really seemed to respect. That other people thought he was a crazy homeless guy, and to steer clear of him. People would see him and get on the other side of the street so they wouldn't have to encounter him. But his friends thought he was one of the greatest people who ever lived. He has a fascinating dichotomy in his personality. I want to talk about his whole life today. He was born in 1876, the centennial here in the United States. At the time he was born in September, the World's Fair in Philadelphia was going on, the first big official World's Fair in America. And it was very well known in East Tennessee, that World's Fair, because it was the World's Fair that promoted East Tennessee marble. And suddenly East Tennessee marble was a thing that was known nationally because the World's Fair people were astonished at this colored marble that they were bringing up in quarries in East Tennessee. It was also the year that Rutherford B. Hayes was elected president, and a compromise signaling the end of Reconstruction, for better or worse. John Neal was born in Ray Springs, a tiny town near the Tennessee River in Ray County. He was born on September 17th, which many of you may recognize as good law students is Constitution Day. And this was the day the Constitution was formally ratified. And John R. Neal, for the rest of his long life, was proud that he was born on Constitution Day and actually commemorated this day with his own kind of distinctive birthday celebration that I'll talk about later. Interesting, he was not born with the name John R. Neal. We know him as John Randolph Neal. He was born as John O'Brien Neal. His son, he was the son of a Tennessee state politician, John Randolph Neale, who was a school teacher who was admitted to the bar in 1859, just before the war. And he had already started in his early 20s, had started to practice law in Athens, Tennessee. His father was in his 20s when he joined the Confederate Army as an enlisted man, was promoted to an officer status before the war's end, but later quickly returned to law and teaching after the war. He was later elected to the state legislature, was soon elected to the state senate, eventually rising to the role of president of the state senate, Tennessee State Senate. When little John was 8 years old, his father, John R. Neale, was elected to U.S. Congress, and he represented Tennessee's 2nd District. But he served just 4 years. He served just 4 years, during which Grover Cleveland was inaugurated the first time in 1885. I said 2nd District. I think it was 3rd District, but not this one. But he was Grover Cleveland was inaugurated president while John R. Neale Sr. was a congressman, and young John R. Neale Jr. remembered attending that inauguration. It was the first of many. It's astonishing that he went back to Washington every 4 years to see the inauguration of the new president for a very, very long time. He chose not to serve a 3rd term in office. Though he was only 51, he was suffering from ill health. John R. Neale Sr. died in 1889, only 3 weeks after his term expired. At the time of his father's death, which was traumatic for the family, John O'Brien Neale was just 12 years old. He had admired his father so much he began calling himself John R. Neale Jr. And knowing him, he probably made that official and legal at some point, but I don't know. I don't have it researched enough to know when that might have happened. His father left a significant estate that allowed the boy to go to college, and he went to the University of Tennessee. The University of Tennessee was fairly newly designated by that time. He was only 14 years old when he entered UT as a freshman. This was not terribly unusual. That was pretty young, but people like Clarence Brown, for example, the future MGM director, entered at age 50. But if you're a really smart teenager, they said, "Why not? Come on, we'll let you." John R. Neale was obviously a very notably smart kid. Here at UT, and UT, of course, it was purely up on the hill. There was no UT except on top of that hill. And it was just like 400 students or so. But he was noted for reciting and speaking in public. He was a member of the Philomathesian Society, which had intellectual events, debates and things like that. I don't hear about that very much. I don't know why. They used to have debate clubs and debate teams and societies, even in high school level, and especially in college. And these would often be open to the public. This was a big deal in the late 19th and early 20th century. I don't know why it died out. It seems like a great thing for kids to learn to do, to debate both sides of an issue, regardless of what they feel. And that's often the way they did it. They were assigned a side and would take that side and do their best with it. And I think, in fact, we ought to practice that as adults, maybe, to understand the other side. But the first time he appears in the paper was when he did a declaration, as they called it, of a poem, a popular poem called "The Polish Boy," a very sentimental poem about an immigrant, and it was by a woman named Anne Stevens. But he seems, in many cases, people who remembered, the very few people who remember John R. Neale remember him as a guy who lived alone a lot of his life, who seemed like a loner, who never cared about his appearance. He was not he does not seem like a sociable guy, but in fact he was a very sociable guy in several ways. He was uncommonly devoted to his family. He had a large family back in Washington. When his father was congressman, there were 5 kids, and they all loved each other, obviously. But he was you see how he is devoted to his family, and how where he lives, and how he makes his decisions over the next several years. In 1892, when he was 16, his older sister, Cornelia, was judged, this is the newspaper, judged by competent critics to be the most beautiful woman in the South. That was as if it was something you could prove. But 6 months later, the same Cornelia, who was so much admired, so much in the society pages, died of consumption, is what we know as tuberculosis. Another sister, Catherine, was having health problems too, and it was clear that she had gotten consumption too. She moved to Denver. In those days, people with tuberculosis were believed to be able to have a better chance at improving themselves, and some people did recover if they went out west to drier air, drier climates. Some people went to San Antonio, some people went to Denver, and the Neale family mother and daughter went to Denver. Meanwhile, John R. Neale graduated from UT in 1893 at age 17. The following year, actually 3 years later, he graduated from Vanderbilt, 1896, with both master's and LLB degrees. LLB was what they called the law degree, and most people interested in the study of law would have been perfectly happy to stay at an LLB degree in the 1890s. It's interesting to think about what was going on in Nashville at the time he was there. It was during the Tennessee Centennial celebrations. You know, Centennial Park, that's where they had the great big exposition there. And I'm sure John R. Neale was aware of that. He moved to New York in 1899 to attend Columbia University. And this was an interesting time to be in New York. It was at the time the consolidation of the 5 boroughs. It was a big city already, but then when they consolidated the 5 boroughs, it became a major metropolis, more than doubling the city's size. Neale was studying law at Columbia shortly before Franklin Roosevelt was there at the same college. I don't think they overlapped, but by several accounts, they got to know each other many years later. I always may extend things too much, but I always like to picture who they would have known in a different place. In New York, there were several interesting people from UT and from Knoxville who were movers and shakers there. One of them was a guy named William Gibbs McAdoo, who was a lawyer himself, a UT grad, who was at that time working as a developer in New York. He was working on construction of the first subway tunnel under the Hudson River. He was about 10 years older than John R. Neale. I don't doubt they might have run across each other, though. McAdoo's father, by the way, was a professor here at UT. Or at the same time, Adolph Ox, son of Bavarian Jewish immigrants who moved to New York in 1896 to publish a small failing newspaper called the New York Times. And he really created the great paper we know today. When you look at today's issue of the Times, you see Adolph Ox's name there because he was the founding publisher of the current family that runs the Times. But he moved to New York the same year that John R. Neale did. I don't know whether they knew each other well or not. Meanwhile, he graduated. His sister and mother were living in Denver. At age 22, in 1899, John R. Neale was named a professor of law at Denver College of Law, University of Denver College of Law. Denver was a pioneer school in a new and rapidly growing city. Denver was bigger than Knoxville at the time, but not much bigger, and was just finding its way as a city. And they had just one of the very few colleges of law in the West was the Denver College of Law, and Neale became, I think, you could say, one of the kind of early champions of the school. Anyway, he moved there. He and his mother had both moved there for his sister, Catherine Neale, who died in 1902. But John R. Neale and his mother continued living in Denver for several years. And he's became notable in Colorado history for drafting the Workmen's Compensation Act for Colorado, which was one of the first in America and became a model for other states to follow. But this is something you don't always hear about when you hear about John R. Neale. He was, interestingly, I mentioned that he was not a loner. In fact, he was a member of several fraternities. Some of them scholarly, like Phi Kappa Phi and Phi, what was the legal fraternity? He was a member of that as well, and I think proud of that. But he was also a member of a social fraternity that was familiar to me because I, a long time ago, for about 2 years, was a member of it myself. Kappa Sigma. He was a Kappa Sig, John Neale. You don't think of this loner, weird guy in downtown Knoxville who lived only his mind as being a frat boy, but he was for a while. And in fact, he remained interested in Kappa Sigma after his graduation. In 1906, he was elected Grand Procurator of Kappa Sigma at a big conclave they had in Chattanooga. So he was the second in charge of the whole national collegiate fraternity. But was a very popular, outgoing young guy and an impressive young guy. He was obviously had a PhD from Columbia in 4 degrees by this time, but was still interested in fraternity things and other things. But he was about 1906, the same year, he decided to spend more time in the East Tennessee area, especially back in Ray County. In 1906, he was elected to the Tennessee House of Representatives from his district in Ray County. By some accounts, he made major and permanent improvements to the state and to his alma mater. Thanks to bills he promoted, UT began getting regular funding. It's kind of funny that whether UT got funding or not from the state before this time was kind of up to the whims of the legislature that year. They would say, do we have extra money to send over to Knoxville and UT? They said, well, sometimes. But he passed a law that they had to give a certain stipend to UT, a substantial one, to the university in those days. This was part of the General Education Bill of 1909 that was proposed by Philander Claxton, who's a very interesting guy in himself who deserves an hour-long talk. Claxton Hall was named for him. But he was a major proponent of public education to the extent that some people at UT said, I think you're more interested in public education at the secondary level than at the college level. Maybe you should do something else. But he kept his job here and was a very fine professor and a guy interested in trying new things. Claxton was promoting this major event every summer called the Summer School of the South. A lot of people see this and they think that's UT Summer School. It was not. It was a major, it was like a Bonnaroo, an intellectual Bonnaroo, something that they had up on the hill in this big building they built just for that purpose. And they would have major speakers from around the world there. They would have people speaking. They would have everybody from John Dewey to Jane Addams from Chicago to lots of well-known speakers. Would be Carl Sandburg was there at least once. But it was that was an interesting time in UT history when thousands of when UT was a college of 500 or 600 students. In the summer, thousands of teachers across the country, especially in the South, would come to UT just to hear the latest authors and speakers and musicians as well. At night they had music and acting and things. There's that could be a whole book just about that fascinating and pretty much forgotten era of UT history. But Claxton was behind that, and Claxton and John R. Neale were close allies on a lot of these issues. But he. The General Education Bill got provided that 30% of state revenue would be dedicated to education, and that was in Neale's original bill. At least they argued about it a lot, and he thought said, okay, 25%, and that was what was finally passed. There were laws providing for normal schools for both black and white public communities. There were laws providing for county school boards. Before that, a lot of the school boards were more political, and they thought we should have a school board that's just elected to take care of schools. Neale also passed legislation reframing UT's Board of Trustees to make it more responsive. It was kind of an old boys club before that, and but also he was an opponent of the death penalty, and at a time when that was not a popular thing to be. his bill to abolish public hangings did succeed. Before the early 1900s, hangings were often done in public, and Neale didn't like the way people responded to that. But another attempt to abolish the death penalty altogether didn't get very far, as you might imagine. But he began playing politics in Nashville and angered some of his former allies. And also his time in Denver, the fact that he was in Denver sometimes half of the year still teaching at the College of Denver, while he was a while he was a Tennessee legislator, sometimes it did become an election issue. But one of the tricky things he did, he was part of what was called the Missing 13, where the Kentucky migration, these were legislators who didn't like a complicated election bill that I need to study more before I can talk much about it. But they didn't like it, and they literally left Tennessee to deny a quorum in Nashville to be able to proceed on this debate. But he finally lost his seat. His last real chance at political advancement, I think, was in 1912, when popular U.S. Senator Robert Taylor died suddenly in Washington. There was a real move to make Taylor's successor, John R. Neale, to be the U.S. Senator from Tennessee. And he came within 11 legislative votes of succeeding. Not very close, but significant. But this was not his last political adventure by a long shot, but it was the last time I think he was almost elected to something. At only 36, his career as an elected official was already over. But in 1909, while he was still a politician and while he was still a professor at Denver, he began teaching law at UT too. He would sometimes teach at UT in the fall and Denver in the spring, and while he was also juggling his legislative responsibilities during the first part of that period. But later, he said he never married. He never did marry. He never had children because he was never around the same women for long enough to get to know them. He was in Knoxville. He was in Gray County. He was in Denver. But who knows? His mother eventually moved back to Knoxville. I think she must have been in mourning for a while, having lost 2 daughters to tuberculosis, and she just stayed in Denver for a long time and moved back to Knoxville in 1910 or so. Lived in the Von Dome, where apparently John R. Neale himself lived. The Von Dome was a rather luxurious, extravagant apartment building on Clinch Avenue with a corner cupola. It was at one time the tallest building in Knoxville. 6 stories tall, but had a French restaurant on top. But was really a fancy place to live. This was the only fancy place to live John R. Neale ever lived. I think he lived there just because his mother was there. But when he began teaching at UT in 1909, joined the faculty in 1910, Brown Ayres was president. He was notable as a scientist and engineer, recently moved from Tulane in New Orleans. And the school was expanding rapidly at this time. Around this time, the law school began meeting in a separate building with the former Knoxville Female Academy, which was over here where the Methodist Church is now. But he was a prominent figure in that law school, and a name that everyone should know. Anytime you talk about UT and law, is that of E.T. Sanford. A lawyer, Stephanie Slater. I don't know if she's here today, but she's doing some programs for us. But she wrote a really interesting book about E.T. Sanford. Thinks he's a major figure in not just Tennessee history, but national history. He was at this time he was a UT trustee, and I think if UT Law School has a godfather, it's E.T. Sanford. I'll mention him a little bit later on. While Sanford and Neale were lecturing here, the UT became one of the first Southern law schools to be inducted into the National Association of American Law Schools. But Ayres died suddenly in 1919. They had just begun building the building now known as Ayres Hall. It was then to be called Administration Hall. They named it Ayres in his memory. Taking over him, a little bit surprisingly, was his kind of henchman, Harcourt Morgan. Morgan is a major figure in this whole story. He was originally from Ontario, I think our only foreign-born UT president. He got his college education there in agriculture and zoology, specializing in entomology. He worked in Louisiana for some years, trying to control the boll weevil infestation. And that's where he got to know Tulane professor Brown Ayres. He was a mild-mannered, unpretentious scientist who found himself suddenly administrator of a growing university. And it's kind of funny to think of a guy who's a boll weevil expert suddenly being in charge of raising money with a cantankerous state legislature and dealing with all the politics that you have to deal with. He was unpretentious to the extent that he liked to wear overalls to administrative meetings, even trustee meetings. But he became Neale's nemesis, and over the years, you see his name come up quite a lot. During that time that he was teaching at UT, John R. Neale lived in residential hotels downtown. He never owned a house in Knoxville. He lived here for 40-something years, but always lived in hotels by himself. And if you know anything about the stories about him, it's not surprising he lived by himself because a lot of people remark that he rarely shaved, he rarely got a haircut, he rarely bathed. He rarely laundered his clothes, except on special occasions like presidential inaugurations. But he lived on his own, and I'd say that with a little trepidation because most people, when they hear John R. Neale, that's the first thing they say. Oh yeah, he never took a bath. But there's a lot more to this guy. I think we need to remember that. He never took a bath because he was thinking about more important things. That's the way I like to think about it. But he did live alone most of his adult life, and he lived in the Oxford Hotel on Clinch Avenue, the Stratford on Wall. I wonder if he was evicted from all these places after a while. He lived in the big Atkin Hotel on Depot, where he lived during his most dramatic periods. That was a big hotel across the street from the railroad station. He was known for his eccentricities. Someone saw him at a formal dinner for UT. Slipping salad into his jacket pocket. He was very economical. He never wasted anything. When his belt broke, he thought, who needs a belt all tied up with a rope? That works just as well. And that's what he often was seen wearing a rope around his pants. He was a famous story about him that he was careless with money. He often didn't cash his paychecks. In fact, when years later, when TVA gave him a large amount of money for his family property, there was about to be inundated by Wattsbar Lake. By one account, it's $90,000. He put this check in his wallet and just forgot about it, and until he was actually paying a small thing for a ham sandwich or something, and the check fell out. And it obviously been in there for months or years, and it was so badly faded that they had to drop another check to cash. But he didn't mind people talking about his eccentricity. He didn't mind people saying about the fact that he was so absent-minded. The only time he ever complained to a columnist was when Bert Vincent wrote about this story about another story about his leaving a jacket at Regas Restaurant. Regas was already there. Was a small restaurant in the bottom of the Watauga Hotel where he was living at the time. But he left a jacket at the restaurant, and they kept expecting someone to come back and pick up this jacket. They finally took it up, and it was dirty. Of course, they made a game attempt to try to find out whose jacket it was, and found $10,000 in negotiable bonds in the pockets. and Neale was when Bert Vincent heard about this, he wrote about this in his column, and Neale said, "Bert, I'm a little afraid someone may try to rob me now." But he also said, this is something, and if this is sincere, this may tell you something about his personal habits. Again, talking to Bert Vincent, he said, please, when you see me needing a shave or needing to clean up, I wish you'd let me know. He also just never noticed when he needed something like that. Anyway, you probably heard of the slaughter of the PhDs. This was the first big dramatic event in his life. Actually, I shouldn't say that. He had a lot of dramatic events, but in those days, it was kind of the opposite of tenure for professors. They had to be renewed every year, and it was like you had to be renewed or you wouldn't have your job. And so that's why professors were always kind of on the edge of their seats about whether they were going to be renewed. This incident started in the summer of 1922 when a professor named Jesse Sprouse, who was a professor of genetic psychology, interesting that UT had one of those in those days, ordered a book by James Harvey Robinson called The Mind in the Making. This was I've read it, you could read it online, free. It's historians look at human potential and how it's stunted by rationalized traditions, especially from religion to patriotism to lots of things that they kind of inhibit our thought processes. It's a combination of just great observations about human nature, but also some kind of bizarre conclusions about human potential. It's kind of in the realm of people who the truism that we only use 10% of our mind. That we need to. They thought the human mind. Reading the book reminds me of what people are saying about AI today, because he was saying the human mind was literally infinite and could solve any problem. This book got a rave review in the local press, with the Republican Knoxville Journal in August 1922 said loved it. It was not just it kind of presupposed human evolution, but it was not mainly about evolution. It kind of raised the profile of science over tradition and questions the underpinnings of patriotism and morality and property rights. It was considered an easy read. It's not an academic book. It would be a very odd book to insist that students read today, because it's not an academic book. There are no footnotes. It's kind of one old man's essay about what's wrong with the world and how we can make it right. But it was referenced several times in local press. A woman named Ruth Cameron in the Knoxville Book Reviewer called it delightful and fascinating. In the book, ideas are described as an illicit passion, or they become an illicit passion when people challenge them in public. And there's paragraphs in the book that I think say a lot about what we're dealing with right now. That when people say you're wrong, they double down, and that's just what they do. So we cleave to them not on their own merit, but for our own self-esteem, and that's what people don't want to say. Gosh, I was wrong. People just don't ever do that, and that was kind of the point of the book. And I think that part of the book is absolutely true. Something about the book was troubling to administrators at UT, though, and there are several reasons, legitimate reasons why you might not have recommended this as just a book for class work. It's not a textbook, but UT founded this box of books and said, "What's this doing here?" and sent it back. John Thaxton was department head of education, was an NYU grad, and author of children's books about health, was asked Sprouse not to use the book because of alleged radical doctrines which the author advocated therein, and particularly his views of evolution. Papers over the course of several months described it in different ways, this book, but usually didn't mention evolution as one of the salient features of the book. Harcourt Morgan proposed that Sprouse teach another course. After a faculty review, Sprouse was dropped from the faculty on grounds that he had not conducted required fieldwork with secondary schools. They didn't mention the book when they said the reason for him being fired. Sprouse, though, said that the Robinson book was the real reason he was being fired from UT. Dean Hoskins recommended that Sproul's be released, and also all the professors who had spoken up in favor of Sproul's. They thought that was insubordinate, and that includes R.S. Ellis, Maurice Mulvaney, R.S. Radford, Asa Schaefer, all defenders of Sproul's. They also got rid of a female art teacher named A.M. Withers. At this point, the Dean of Law, Malcolm McDermott, who had been having a hard time with John R. Neal's eccentricities, he was a younger guy, and it's kind of awkward, I think, to be a younger guy in charge of a guy in his 40s who has a reputation of going his own way. And McDermott was an educated guy. He'd been at Princeton. He studied under Woodrow Wilson and was a Harvard law grad. Came here to work for a lawyer, but he recommended while you're cleaning out, you ought to clean the law school of Dr. Neale. That was, it said, okay, and they just had a clean sweep of all the troublesome faculty members all at once. But there were several reasons for Dr. Neale's dismissal, including inattention to grading and missing classes. The official quote was, he did not fit in with the policy of the university. That was in July of 1923. There's obviously general insubordination that was their concern. He didn't answer to Harcourt Morgan. He didn't answer to what's his name? But the Hoskins. This was a crisis at UT. I think to an extent that Harcourt Morgan didn't understand at first. He thought he could just get rid of all the troublesome people, and then it'd be clear sailing for the 23-24 year. But Governor Austin Peay heard about this, and there was a great deal of pushback from the student body, especially that Austin Peay called for a public meeting of the Board of Trustees at the Farragut Hotel. So public, it was going to be downtown, not on campus. And that this dramatic scene was described as bedlam. They said about 200 people were there, most of them students, siding with Neale. One trustee was not present. In fact, the meeting that started, he excused himself because with a very good excuse, he didn't want to deal with this controversy. He had just been nominated to the U.S. Supreme Court. That was E.T. Sanford. E.T. Sanford is the only Knoxvilleian, the only UT person who's been exalted to the U.S. Supreme Court. He left the meeting and was not, so didn't have to contend with this controversy. But Neale was not at the meeting himself either at first, but as they enumerated 14 charges against Neale, some of them pretty trivial. One that he smoked cigars at Ayers Hall when they knew that there was a no smoking rule at Ayers Hall, this brand new building that everybody was proud of. Also that he sided with students in disputes. Also that he didn't really give grades. They introduced some evidence about this because he gave everybody in his law class a 95. That was not perfect, but good enough. But the trustees, with two exceptions, voted to support Morgan's decision to fire Neale. One of those who did not, was an exception, was Governor Austin Peay. Though he claimed that he supported Morgan's work in general. Neale finally appeared. I don't know how he got the word about this meeting, but he walked in and was greeted by an outburst of applause and cheers that lasted for some time. Professor Neale sought to control his emotions, but was visibly nervous. His face paled and he tried to utter something as he gasped out at a number of students who he had taught and rallied to his defense. He called some of the charges glaringly false. He claimed never to have missed a class in 13 years. And he said, UT has been a source of love and devotion to duty. Neale denounced Morgan, this is kind of the end of his relationship with him, as legally, morally, and mentally incompetent. He's talking about the UT president. He said he has initiated a system of terrorism at the university, both in our faculty and our student body. He claimed that the UT's Board of Trustees, furthermore, had been improperly constituted based on the laws that he had passed 20 years earlier in the state legislature, and included one bank president who did substantial business with the university and had a clear conflict of interest. But a great majority of the law students at UT signed a petition to keep him on the faculty. But it was clear that after all this fighting, either he or Morgan would have to go, and UT discontinued him and the long honored John R. Neale Award for Oratory. So I would love to see that revived, by the way. But this got national attention. In Baltimore, H.L. Mencken, who later was a figure in the Scopes trial, called Neale an able lawyer and a man of repute. In any northern state, his courage would get him the praise it deserves. He added, the state buzzes with trivial, idiotic gossip about him, that he dresses shabbily, had political ambitions, etc. Neale has carried himself in a way that does high credit to his profession and even higher to his native state. But his native state, instead of being proud of him, simply stabs him in the back. The dean of the Denver College of Law came to his defense. Neale had left Denver College to concentrate on UT back in 1917, I think, but everybody remembered Neale fondly in Denver, and they spoke up in his regard. This was a national story. This is in hundreds of newspapers. But the American Association of University Professors investigated the story and came to the conclusion, back to the original issue about evolution, that Sproul's attitude toward evolution, quote, was not one of the reasons for his dismissal and certainly not the controlling reason. So who knows what the truth about all that was. Neale wasn't unemployed for very long. Almost immediately after being fired, and this is the great, just a fantasy revenge, he founded the John R. Neale School of Law. And it was more popular than UT's law school for about 15 years after that. It was originally located on the third floor of a bank building on Gay. I think a building that's still there on Gay and Summit Hill. But it was soon on the second floor of a building on Market Street near Clinch, now long gone, where it kept a presence for about 30 years. It was actually bigger than UT's law school, at least in terms of graduating classes, and included several prominent attorneys and at least one sheriff among its graduates. He had guest speakers, including state Supreme Court justices, U.S. senators, an undersecretary of labor was a speaker, and Clarence Darrow was eventually a speaker at John R. Neale School of Law. Anyway, this was this sets the stage for the John Scopes trial. John Scopes was, of course, a teacher, mainly a football coach, but had been a substitute teacher, who had agreed beforehand in early 1925 in a conversation with Sue Hicks, the prospective prosecutor. And the whole story of Sue Hicks is fascinating because it's probably can't get into it now. But he was befriended by John Mutu of the Knoxville News, but for Neale, this opportunity was a coincidence that the biggest legal crisis of the decade was happening in a town he knew very well. This was the county seat of his home county in Dayton, in Ray County. And Neale offered his services to Scopes. He insisted he wanted to win the case on the merits of freedom of speech, that was merely unconstitutional to forbid a teacher from teaching ideas. Neale's goal was to take it to federal court and have the whole thing overturned. But he was in conversation with the ACLU before Clarence Darrow offered his services. Perhaps too recklessly, Neale, is the lead defense attorney, agreed to bring in Clarence Darrow. The ACLU was not happy about that. They knew that Clarence Darrow was a lightning rod for, he loved conflict, he loved belittling his opponents. He thought, this is not the guy we need for this case. But the thing was already signed. He was already on his way to Dayton. But Neale himself played only small perfunctory roles in the courtroom drama. You see his name come up. He would make occasional objections and motions. But of course, Darrow famously carried most of the water in that case. In the end, the more aggressive Darrow took the forefront, going for the throat by ridiculing the prosecuting attorney Bryan and undermining the veracity of the Bible rather than limiting his attack to the constitutional issue, which is what Neale wanted to keep it to. But Darrow later said of Neale, he is a fine man and could have been a good lawyer if he had given his time to it, but he has chosen to be a professor and is not equipped to take the leading part in arguing this case. But John Scopes loved Neale. He described him later as a kind and sympathetic person behind a shy face, one of the warmest hearted men I've ever known. His untidy facade hid a keen and analytic mind. Basically, he was a good man and a clean thinker, a much rarer person than most spotless, clean-shaven, and shorn clothes sources I have seen. His coming to Dayton was one of the fortunate things that happened to us. John Mutu, writing for The Nation, a Knoxville writer writing for The Nation magazine, wrote, "The farmers all like him for his simple tastes and ways. Most of the young lawyers in the state would be willing to die for him." Joseph Wood Crouch wrote a story about The Nation, the guy, again, lived on Cumberland Avenue, titled "Tennessee Where Cowards Rule." This was one of the most scathing things. I'm not sure Macon even ever got more insulting than that. But his point was that Dayton had become the butt of jokes, but it was not unusual for any American town. So there's not a county in America that doesn't have it. It's Dayton. But he said what's egregious is the fact that those who knew better and those in power did not speak out in public. And in particular, he was pointing his finger at Harcourt Morgan, the president of UT at the time. Anyway, this was some of the arguments made in the case was that this was it was weird that the students, the teachers at the time were called to teach from a book, but also were told not to teach evolution. But the book had evolution. They'd been teaching evolution already until they had not replaced it with another book. So it was completely nonsensical. But still, Scopes was found guilty. This was But it's interesting that John R. Neale is sometimes and sometimes not remembered for his role as the lead defense attorney. There were actually in total 5 defense attorneys, including Darrow and Neale. And as of this morning, in the Wikipedia page where John Scopes mentions the other 4 defense attorneys, but not Neale. Anyway, this was the height of his fame nationally. It was not necessarily his biggest effort in the 1920s. John R. Neale was involved in other things. I want to mention, though, before we close, that both John R. Neale, this was the time of the Great Smoky Mountain National Park movement in 1925, the same time as the trial was going on. And both William James Bryan and Clarence Darrow had expressed interest in seeing the Smokies via Elkmont, and they were both expected to come to Knoxville and then take a train to Elkmont. Darrow got there first, and while he was enjoying Elkmont, he was at Elkmont when he heard of Bryan's sudden death. Bryan arrived in Knoxville a few days later, but on a funeral train. Bryan, of course, had died a few days after the trial. This was the subject of an early country song by Charlie Oakes, our new music history guy coming up. The guy that is now considered the first professional country musician was a blind street busker named Charlie Oakes, who wrote and sang this song called "The Death of William Jennings Bryan." And it was one of the earliest country music recordings that are available. It came out in 1920, literally 1 month after Bryan's death. So he wrote it and recorded it in a very short time. Darrow visited Knoxville again a couple years later to speak at the John R. Neale School of Law. So that was a big deal when Neale when he came here and he was interviewed in the lobby of the Acton Hotel where Neale was living at the time. Well, I meant to get into TVA and the whole thing. John R. Neale was an early advocate of public control of the Tennessee Valley and its water sources and of the water hazards that are entailed there. And was sometimes his friends called him the father of TVA. You won't see this in any TVA history, but he was in the 1920s, 10 years before Roosevelt was elected, was advocating for public ownership, federal ownership of the Tennessee Valley for building dams, and was during this time was constantly working against the private power companies who were trying to take over. And he thought this would be terrible if we had private companies building and owning dams on the Tennessee River. I think we can thank him because he did some remarkable things. I want to just mention this. My favorite quote of Neale was not about Scopes, but about the Tennessee Valley. He liked to show up at meetings uninvited, and was at the Federal Power Commission meeting in Chattanooga, and was there as Charles Cates of Knoxville, another attorney that Neale, I'm sure, knew well. was representing one of the big energy corporations that wanted to build a dam on the Tennessee River. And they got annoyed with this, with John R. Neale showing up and bringing up things that weren't on the agenda. And they said, "Whom do you represent?" John R. Neale said, "I represent the people." He said, "I mean to say, who's paying you?" Neale said, "I've observed that when an attorney represents the people, he pays his own fee." So that's John R. Neale in a nutshell. He went on through his life, kept running the John R. Neale School of Law in this small space in a building downtown every year. And every year on Constitution Day, September 17th, John R. Neale would give a lecture about the Constitution that the public was invited to. And he did this every single year, as surely as he went to see every single inauguration of the president. He spoke on Constitution Day in downtown Knoxville, gave a free lecture about the meaning of the U.S. Constitution. He said he would give honorary degrees to judges and people like that who've been students of his, but he said, "I want this to be open to the people because this is the people need to know about their Constitution." But anyway, we have a couple of minutes maybe for questions or comments. I'm calling it for another couple of hours, but I won't do that. But there's a lot here. There's a whole book in this, and a lot of information out there. John R. Neale was a public figure for more than 50 years, and you can imagine just how much information out there, how many opinions there are about him and by him. He was also had a law career defending interesting clients, and especially in labor. But anyway, any questions?